In 1968, a scientific journal recommended American adults eat no more than 3 eggs a week, and grocery store egg sales dropped almost overnight. Millions of people looked at a food humans had eaten for tens of thousands of years and suddenly treated it like a quiet threat sitting in their refrigerator. The soft crack of a shell, the slide of yolk into a hot pan, something that simple had become a source of genuine fear and confusion. How did one of the oldest, most basic foods on Earth become the subject of decades of scientific reversal and public anxiety? But this story really starts hundreds of thousands of years earlier, long before there were refrigerators, or nutrition labels, or anyone capable of reading either. Eggs, in the broadest sense, predate humanity entirely. Birds, and before them, dinosaurs and other reptiles, had been laying eggs for hundreds of millions of years before the first early humans ever picked one up out of curiosity or hunger. For early hominins, and later, early Homo sapiens, wild bird eggs would have been an obvious, opportunistic food source, protein-rich, portable, and available seasonally in nests scattered across forests, cliffs, and grasslands. Archaeological evidence, including eggshell fragments found at ancient human sites in parts of Africa, suggests that humans were gathering and consuming wild eggs, likely from ostriches and other ground-nesting birds, tens of thousands of years before any form of settled agriculture existed. This wasn't farming. It was simply foraging, taking advantage of what nature already provided, the same way early humans gathered berries or dug up roots. The real turning point, the moment eggs shift from opportunistic foraged food to something closer to a managed resource, comes with the domestication of chickens, and this is a story with a surprisingly specific, if still debated, origin point. Most archaeologists and geneticists believe that the chicken, Gallus domesticus, was domesticated from the red jungle fowl, a wild bird native to Southeast Asia, with genetic and archaeological evidence pointing toward domestication occurring in regions of Southeast Asia and southern China sometime around 8,000 years ago, possibly earlier. It's worth being honest here, because for a long time, textbooks pointed to the Indus Valley as chicken domestication's origin point. But more recent genetic research has shifted scholarly consensus significantly towards Southeast Asia instead, and this remains an active area of ongoing archaeological and genetic study, not a fully settled matter. What's genuinely fascinating is that early chicken domestication doesn't appear to have started with eggs or meat as the primary motivation at all. Some researchers who study early Southeast Asian archaeological sites have suggested that early domesticated chickens may have initially been valued for other reasons, possibly religious or ceremonial significance, or even, according to some historians, an early interest in cockfighting before their role as a reliable food source became the dominant reason for keeping them. It's a genuinely strange thought. The humble breakfast staple sitting in refrigerators worldwide may have started its relationship with humanity for reasons that had almost nothing to do with food at all. However it began, the practical benefits of keeping domesticated chickens close to human settlements became obvious quickly. Unlike wild bird eggs, which had to be found, often at real physical risk depending on the nesting location, domesticated chickens could be kept nearby, bred, and would reliably produce eggs on a regular basis. This is where eggs transition from an occasional foraged into something closer to a dependable dietary staple. And as chicken domestication spread outward from Southeast Asia across Asia into the Middle East, and eventually into the Mediterranean world, eggs traveled right alongside them. By the time we reach ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, chickens and their eggs become genuinely woven into daily life, and once again, religious symbolism, a pattern that seems to repeat itself across nearly every ancient food this kind of story touches. Egyptian records and artwork from various periods reference eggs and symbolic contexts, and ancient Egyptian civilization is also credited with early of artificial egg incubation, using carefully managed heat sources to hatch eggs in large numbers outside of a natural nesting environment, a technique that, if accurately dated to as early as some historians suggest, would represent genuinely sophisticated agricultural innovation for its time. Here's a detail worth sitting with, because it's one of the more surprising pivots in the egg's ancient history. Ancient Roman writers, including the naturalist Pliny the Elder, document extensive Roman culinary use of eggs, along with early versions of dishes that modern food historians consider ancestors of things like custards and even primitive versions of what we might recognize as omelette-style preparations. The Romans also developed early methods for candling eggs, holding them up to a light source to check freshness, whether an egg was fertilized, a practical technique that, in modified form, food inspectors and small farmers still use today, nearly 2,000 years later. It's a small detail, but it's genuinely remarkable how little the basic physics of checking an egg's freshness has changed across 2 millennia. But it's really in ancient Rome and the broader Mediterranean world where we start hints of the tension that would define much of the eggs-leg cultural history. A genuine, persistent disagreement of cultures and eras about whether eggs were a healthy food, a dangerous one, a symbol of purity, or a symbol of something to be avoided entirely. And this is where the title of this video starts to earn its keep, because very few common foods in human history have generated quite much sustained cultural and scientific disagreement. In various ancient Mediterranean medical traditions, including ideas that trace back to Greek physicians like Galen, whose theories on the 4 humors dominated Western medical thinking for well over 1,000 years, eggs were viewed through a complicated lens. Depending on how they were prepared, cooked or raw, were believed to have different effects on the body's supposed humoral balance, sometimes considered nourishing and beneficial, other times considered heavy, difficult to digest, or even harmful if eaten in excess or by certain types of people, according to the medical theories of the time. It's worth being clear that Galenic humoral theory doesn't reflect anything close to modern medical or nutritional science, but it does show something genuinely important. Humans have been arguing about whether eggs are good or bad for you for a very long time, long before anyone had the scientific tools to actually settle the question with real evidence. As Christianity spread across Europe following the decline of the Western Roman Empire, eggs took on an entirely new layer of cultural and religious meaning, one that would create genuine tension within religious communities for centuries. During certain periods of the medieval Christian calendar, particularly during Lent, the weeks of fasting and penitence leading up to Easter, eggs were often classified alongside meat and dairy as foods to be avoided or restricted, based on evolving and, importantly, regionally inconsistent interpretations of religious dietary rules established by various church authorities over time. This created a genuinely practical problem for medieval households. Chickens don't stop laying eggs just because a religious calendar says humans shouldn't eat them. Here's a mini cliffhanger worth building on, because the resolution to this problem produced one of history's more charming and enduring cultural traditions. Medieval households across Europe, faced with an accumulating surplus of eggs during Lenten fasting periods, needed ways to preserve and eventually use up that surplus once Easter arrived and dietary restrictions lifted. Historians generally point to this practical seasonal surplus combined with pre-existing pagan spring symbolism, associate eggs in various pre-Christian European traditions as the likely combined origin of the now familiar custom of Easter eggs, a tradition that historians note absorbed and blended multiple older cultural threads over centuries rather than from any single clean origin point. It's genuinely one of the clearer examples in food history of a religious restriction directly producing a beloved cultural tradition almost by practical necessity. Medieval and early modern Europe also developed increasingly sophisticated, if occasionally bizarre by modern standards, beliefs and practices around eggs. Various medieval medical texts and folk traditions, all sorts of properties to eggs, from fertility symbolism to supposed medicinal uses, and eggs appeared regularly in medieval cookbooks across a surprisingly wide range of dishes, from simple boiled preparations for common households to elaborate, spiced egg-based dishes served at wealthy banquets. The egg, in other words, had become something close to a culinary blank canvas, adaptable enough to appear in the simplest peasant meal and the most elaborate noble feast, a versatility that few other single ingredients in medieval Europe could genuinely claim. As European exploration and colonization expanded from the late 15th century onward, chickens, and with them the practice of egg farming, spread to the Americas and other parts of the world where they hadn't previously existed in domesticated form, joining that broader Columbian exchange of plants, animals, and agricultural knowledge moving between the Old World and New World. Chickens adapted remarkably well to a wide range of climates and conditions, and small-scale egg production became a nearly universal feature of farms and even individual households across huge portions of the colonized world within just a few generations. Now, here's where the story shifts from ancient and medieval food culture into something close to industrial and scientific history, and it's a genuinely significant turning point worth real attention. For most of human history, up through the 18th and even much of the 19th century, egg production remained fundamentally small-scale, tied to individual farms and households where a family might keep a modest flock of hens, collecting eggs daily for their own consumption or for sale at local markets. This began to change dramatically with the broader agricultural and industrial transformations of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The development of larger-scale poultry farming, improved incubation technology, artificial large-scale hatching of chicks, and eventually refrigerated transportation and storage, transformed egg production from a small, seasonal activity into an increasingly industrialized, year-round commercial industry, particularly across the United States and parts of Europe during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This is a genuinely important worth sitting with, because it represents the moment eggs stop being something most households produced themselves and start becoming something most people purchased from increasingly distant, increasingly large-scale commercial operations, a pattern that would only accelerate as the 20th century progressed. There's a human story worth pausing on here, because it's easy to describe industrialization in abstract economic terms, rather than through the lens of individual people navigating genuine change. Consider a small family farmer in the American Midwest in the early 20th century, someone who had spent years keeping a modest flock of hens for local sale, now watching more mechanized commercial operations begin to undercut prices and dominate regional markets, forcing countless smaller egg producers to either scale up dramatically, adapt to new industrial methods, or exit the business entirely. This transition, repeated across countless farming communities throughout the early and mid-20th century, represents a genuine, often difficult economic and cultural shift, one that fundamentally reshaped rural life across huge portions of the industrializing world, even as it made eggs cheaper and more consistently available to the growing populations of expanding cities. By the mid-20th century, eggs had become an inexpensive, reliable, widely available staple across much of the industrialized world, closely associated with a staple, protein-rich diet, particularly in the post-World War II United States, where egg consumption climbed steadily as suburban households embraced convenient, protein-forward breakfast culture. And this is exactly the point in the story where the tension promised in this video's title reaches its genuine climax, because everything was about to change, not because of religion or economics this time, but because of science, and specifically because of cholesterol. Starting in the mid-20th century, medical researchers began investigating the relationship between dietary cholesterol, blood cholesterol levels, and cardiovascular disease, an area of genuinely important and legitimate scientific inquiry given the significant rise in heart disease as a leading cause of death across industrialized nations during this period. Because egg yolks contain a relatively high amount of dietary cholesterol compared to many other common foods, eggs became a specific and prominent focus of this emerging research, and eventually of public health recommendations. Here's the moment worth building real tension around, because it represents one of the most dramatic and, in hindsight, genuinely complicated reversals in modern nutritional science history. Throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, major health organizations, including groups like the American Heart Association, issued dietary guidelines recommending significant limits on egg consumption based on the prevailing scientific understanding at the time that dietary cholesterol directly and significantly raised blood cholesterol levels in most people, thereby increasing cardiovascular disease risk. Egg sales, understandably, dropped substantially during this period as public awareness of these recommendations spread through widely publicized health guidance and media coverage. A food that had been a completely unremarkable dietary staple for literally thousands of years suddenly carried the cultural weight of a genuine health in the minds of millions of people. But here's what makes this such a genuinely fascinating case study rather than a simple, one-directional story, and it's worth handling with real care and honesty. As nutritional science continued to advance over subsequent decades, developed a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between dietary cholesterol and blood cholesterol. That for most people, dietary cholesterol has a considerably smaller impact on blood cholesterol levels than researchers had initially in the mid-20th century, with genetics, overall dietary patterns, and factors like saturated fat intake playing larger roles than low cholesterol-focused research had emphasized. This isn't to say the earlier research was conducted in bad faith. It reflects the genuinely iterative, self-correcting nature of scientific understanding, where earlier findings, based on the best available evidence and methods of their time, get refined, complicated, and sometimes substantially revised as research techniques improve and larger, more sophisticated studies become possible. By the 2000s and 2010s, major health organizations, including the United States Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, had substantially walked back earlier strict recommendations limiting dietary cholesterol and egg consumption, specifically reflecting this evolved scientific understanding. It's genuinely important to note, in the interest of accuracy and avoiding oversimplification in either direction, that nutritional science, eggs, cardiovascular health, and cholesterol remains an area of active, ongoing research, and current guidance often emphasizes that eggs can be part of a healthy diet for most people, while still noting that individual factors, including existing health conditions, can affect how any given person's body responds to dietary cholesterol. This isn't a simple story of science being wrong and then being right. It's a story of science working exactly as it's supposed to, gradually refining understanding over decades based on accumulating evidence, even when that refinement creates genuine public confusion along the way. This whole saga is genuinely one of the clearest examples in modern food history of that irony this story keeps circling back to. A food eaten essentially without controversy for tens of thousands of years suddenly became a symbol of dietary anxiety for an entire generation, only to gradually, carefully work its way back toward broad acceptance as scientific understanding matured and became more nuanced. Few common foods have had quite such a dramatic, well-documented rise, fall, and partial recovery in public health perception within a single human lifetime. Meanwhile, as this scientific drama unfolded, the egg industry itself continued its own parallel transformation, one that introduced its own genuine controversies and ongoing debates, separate from the cholesterol question, but very much part of the broader story of eggs in the modern world. Industrial-scale egg production, which had continued expanding steadily throughout the 20th century to meet growing demand, increasingly relied on intensive farming methods including battery cage systems that housed large numbers of hens in relatively confined spaces to maximize production efficiency and keep costs low for consumers. Here's a genuinely important thread worth handling honestly, because it represents real, ongoing ethical and political debate rather than a settled historical matter. Starting particularly in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, growing public awareness and concern about animal welfare in industrial egg production led to significant consumer advocacy, legislative action in various countries and states, and genuine industry change. The European Union, for instance, banned conventional battery cages starting in 2012, following years of debate and gradual thin requirements, while various individual American states have passed their own legislation over subsequent years restricting or banning certain confined caging practices, alongside the rise of cage-free and free-range, as consumers increasingly sought out eggs produced under different welfare standards. It's worth being genuinely even-handed here, because this remains an area of legitimate, ongoing demand among consumers, farmers, animal welfare advocates, and agricultural economists, rather than a question with one universally agreed-upon answer. Proponents of these welfare-focused changes point to genuine ethical concerns about animal treatment in intensive confinement systems. Critics and some agricultural economists have raised legitimate points about the increased costs associated with cage-free and free-range production methods, and ongoing research and debate continues regarding the actual comparative welfare outcomes, land use implications, and economic accessibility trade-offs between different egg production systems. This isn't a story with a clean, simple resolution, and presenting it as one would genuinely misrepresent an area where reasonable people, informed by different values and different readings of complex evidence, continue to disagree. Alongside these welfare debates, the 21st century has also seen the rise of genuinely significant egg alternatives and substitutes, driven by a combination of factors including plant-based dietary trends, environmental sustainability concerns, and continuing food allergy considerations. Since eggs remain one of the most common food allergens, particularly among children, companies developing plant-based substitutes using ingredients like mung bean protein or various other plant compounds designed to replicate eggs' culinary functions in cooking and baking represent a genuinely notable modern chapter in this story. One that would have been almost unimaginable to a medieval European household relying on a small flock of hens for their entire egg supply. There's also a periodic, more disruptive thread run through the modern egg story worth acknowledging honestly, because it's directly relevant to anyone who's noticed egg prices fluctuate dramatically at the grocery store in recent years. Outbreaks of highly pathogenic influenza, commonly known as bird flu, have periodically caused significant disruptions to commercial egg supplies in various countries, including the United States, requiring the culling of large numbers of affected poultry flocks to control disease spread and resulting in real, documented egg price spikes and supply shortages during particularly severe outbreak periods in recent years. It's a genuinely modern echo of something ancient farmers would have understood instinctively, that a food supply built on living creatures carries an inherent vulnerability to disease that no amount of industrial efficiency can fully eliminate. So where does all of this leave the humble egg today in a world of industrial farming, ongoing welfare debates, evolving nutritional science, and periodic disease-driven supply disruptions? This is genuinely one of the more remarkable parts of the egg's modern story, worth sitting with for a moment. Despite everything, despite decades of scientific reversal, ethical controversy, and periodic supply crises, the egg remains one of the most widely consumed, most nutritionally studied, and most culturally universal foods on the entire planet. According to data tracked by organizations like the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, China is by a significant margin the world's largest egg producer, followed by the United States, India, and various other major agricultural nations, with global egg production numbering in the trillions of eggs annually, a scale that would have been genuinely unimaginable to those early Southeast Asian communities who first began being domesticated jungle fowl close to their settlements thousands of years ago. And here's where this story circles back in a genuinely full-circle way to where we started. That 1968 recommendation limiting consumption to 3 per week, the moment that opened this entire story, wasn't really the final word on eggs at all. It was one chapter, a genuinely significant one, in a much longer, ongoing scientific and cultural conversation about a food, it turns out, humans have never fully stopped arguing about, going all the way back to ancient Roman physicians, debating humoral theory and medieval church authorities, debating Lenten dietary restrictions. The 3-egg recommendation felt, at the time, like settled science delivered with real authority. Decades later, it reads more like a snapshot-specific, limited scientific moment, since revised, refined, and complicated by better evidence and more sophisticated research methods, exactly the kind of scientific evolution that responsible nutrition science is actually supposed to look like, even when it doesn't feel satisfying or certain in the moment it's happening. It's genuinely strange, when you step back and look at the whole sweep of it, that something as unassuming as an egg, a smooth oval shell containing nothing more complicated than yolk and white, has managed to generate this much sustained human disagreement of literally thousands of years, spanning ancient medical theory, medieval religious restriction, industrial economic transformation, modern scientific reversal, and ongoing ethical debate about how the animals producing them ought to be treated. Very few foods carry quite that much accumulated argument inside something so small and so plain. The next time you crack an egg into a hot pan or boil one for a quick breakfast, it's worth remembering that you're holding something that's been sacred, suspicious, essential, restricted, celebrated, and scientifically reversed, sometimes more than once, across the entire span of recorded human history. The egg itself never really changed. What changed, over and over again, was us, our science, our ethics, our economics. All of it circling endlessly around one small, unremarkable, endlessly debated food that somehow never stopped part of the human table. If this journey through the surprisingly contested history of something as basic as an egg gave you a new way of looking at your next breakfast, let me know in the comments which everyday food you'd want uncovered next, because it turns out almost nothing in the kitchen is quite as simple as it looks. And if you enjoyed this one, hit subscribe, drop a like, and I'll see you in the next story.